Hello, my name is Marco Carnovale, and this is the second part of a two-part set of presentations on NATO. The first one was about the history of the alliance during the Cold War up until the end of the uh, Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. This one will take it from there until the current events in Europe, in the Ukraine in particular. So NATO after the end of the Cold War, is it resurgent or redundant? This is the dilemma that planners were facing when this happened, this map that we had grown up with blue forces on the west, NATO, and east with red forces, Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, all of a sudden became obsolete. By the way, this is a real map that was used in NATO for planning purposes. It was later declassified, which is why I can show it here, but this is what a generation or two maybe of planners grew up with. So the Soviet Union is dissolved. Our threat is no longer there, people thought. Christmas Day of 1991, the Soviet flag comes down from the Kremlin for the last time. Eastern European countries embrace democracy. Romania, for example, famously cut the socialist emblem that was in the middle of their flag to signify that they were now still Romanian, but they were a national Romania and they were not a socialist Romania anymore. Karl Marx is really out of fashion. The juxtaposition of American and Soviet forces on the inter-German border is no longer there. This is, again, a border over which the planning was developed over decades for World War III, really. And all of a sudden, Germany is unified, and this is just now a border between two German Länder. Nuclear missiles that had been capable of striking each other deep into NATO and Warsaw Pact Soviet territory had been withdrawn because of treaties between the Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev mainly. And the remarkable thing is that during all this time, NATO never fired a shot. These are exercises, but NATO won the Cold War without firing a single shot. Individual member states of NATO did. For example, the British in the Falklands, they fought a conflict against the Argentina's invasion, but that was not a NATO operation. It was a national operation. As I mentioned in my last talk, NATO forces remain national forces until a crisis happens where they are integrated into the NATO structure. The relations with Russia seem to be not only mending, but developing very well. President Yeltsin, of course, had had a hand in taking Russia out of the Soviet Union. He was on very good terms with President Clinton, and Goodbye Lenin, which is the title of a famous movie of this period, is symbolic of the new era being born. So why keep NATO really? Well, for three reasons I will mention now in succession. The first is that there is still demand for countries to join NATO. Not only no country left NATO, but new countries wanted to join. For example, Spain joined already in they asked to join in 1992, still during the Cold War, but at the end of it, so to say, they joined in 86 when the ratification process was completed. Germany, of course, when it was unified, it joined NATO as a united Germany. And this was a source of some controversy because at that time, some NATO leaders, including the Secretary General, including Secretary of State Baker, had promised that this would be it, that NATO wouldn't enlarge further to the east. And that, of course, then happened. NATO did expand to the east, as we will see, and this created a lot of friction with Russia. The members of the Warsaw Pact themselves, Warsaw Pact is no longer there, but countries like Poland wanted to join NATO. So there is demand. This is a photo I took in Poland in 1980 when I was a young student there. You can see the posters of the regime at the time, NATO no, depicting very threatening NATO bombs and guns and aircraft, and NATO no. This is Poland 2010, so 30 years later, all of a sudden Poland is in NATO. It not only doesn't oppose NATO, but it joins NATO. And many other countries over successive waves of enlargement joined NATO in the intervening years. I won't go into all the details here, but you can see that from 1949, when the 12 member states here in black were the original small Western base of NATO, and then all the way to 2023, when Finland and Sweden, which is not painted here, but they joined after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, abandoning decades of neutrality in the case of Finland and even centuries in the case of Sweden. So the popularity of NATO continues to grow despite the end of the Cold War over the intervening 25, 30 years or so. This, of course, changed the nature of NATO a lot. So 12 member states around a small table. It was a very intimate sort of relationship of discussions that were taking place among like-minded countries. And all of a sudden you have like a small stadium here of 30 plus member states around a huge table discussing, obviously in a much more formal, much more structured way. This really changed the nature of the relationship among the allies. What about Russia and Ukraine? I mentioned how Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, they all wanted to join NATO, and they did, one after the other. With Ukraine, there was some desire on the part of Ukraine as far back as the 90s, when I was working at NATO on Ukraine, actually, to join. But NATO didn't allow Ukraine to join because we feared angering Russia. And some, in retrospect, now think this was a mistake, that we should have put Ukraine in the alliance right away. Some think that even developing the relationship as much as we did unnecessarily provoked the Russians. We also had a fairly strong relationship with Russia. There was this so-called NATO-Russia Council that was established in 1997. It wasn't really influencing the way NATO worked. It was outside NATO. It was between Russia and NATO. But nonetheless, it took a lot of energy from the member states. A lot of cooperative programs were launched, a lot of initiatives. That didn't take away the fact that the Russians were very uneasy with the fact that NATO was expanding, and they were not going to be let in. There was a discussion at some point that Russia should become a member of NATO, but it didn't go very far, among other reasons, because many in Russia also did not want to join an American-dominated alliance, in their view. Anyway, so a lot of interest in the expansion of NATO, which is why NATO continued to exist. The second reason is that war returned in Europe. When war started in the former Yugoslavia, people said NATO has to go out of area or be out of business. Out of area means work out of the territory of the NATO member states. NATO was founded to defend the member states, the territory of the member states, from an external threat. Here, it was asked to go and intervene to stop the war, civil war, I would call it, in the former Yugoslavia. The reason is that nobody else did. I mean, the UN and the EU were impotent to fight, to stop the fighting. Well, impotent to fight, to stop the fighting. And so the response of NATO was to go, the accusation of going out of area or out of business was out of date because NATO did intervene. And the slogan was coined by somebody, I don't know who, that while the EU funds and the UN feeds, only NATO fights. And so NATO went in, and for the first time in its history, it fired a shot. In February of 1924, the NATO aircraft shot down Serbian aircraft which had violated a no-fly zone and were bombing Bosnian positions. And this is how NATO found itself into an actual hot war for the first time in its history. That was not the end of it. With the massacres continuing in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia in particular, the Srebrenica one in 1995 was a particularly ferocious one that showed again the impotence of other organizations to stop these massacres. This happened despite the presence of United Nations blue helmets. And so NATO put boots on the ground, as they say. And the IFOR, the implementation force, was born to actually stop the fighting on the ground, not just aircraft flying and bombing, but fighting on the ground in Bosnia. Things improved in Bosnia, but didn't really improve much in the neighborhood. The Kosovo War started in 1999 with the Serbia trying to repress the revolts, they call them, or revolutions from the Albanian point of view, of the Albanians in Kosovo. And NATO intervened there as well to stop the ethnic cleansing, as some put it. And KFOR was born. KFOR, so the Kosovo force, was born with the participation of many member states of NATO. In fact, I think all of them. But also member states of the KFOR were not members of NATO, including Russia. And that's why you see the seal of KFOR there written on the right-hand side in Cyrillic, KFOR, KFOR, that's in the Russian, because Russia was part of it. So here you are, peace enforcement operations with the NATO forces on the ground to prevent fighting from spreading. You can see Ukrainian forces, Russians on the lower and the upper left corner photographs. Swiss, I mean, Swiss, of course, are well known for neutrality. They are not members of NATO, probably never will be, but they participated in KFOR as well. The most significant of all of these was the Russian participation, and I cannot overemphasize how symbolically this was important to show NATO and Russia working together. This actually caused some friction within NATO itself. The reason is, on the 12th of June of 1999, the Russians had this good idea of occupying the airport of Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, without giving any prior warning to NATO. Remember, this was a joint operation of Russia and the NATO alliance, but the reaction from NATO was quite dismayed, and the Supreme Allied Commander, the American General Clark, wanted to retake the airport of Pristina by force from the Russians. And famously, Michael Jackson, who's not a singer, obviously, but the deputy of General Clark, a British general, responded, "I am not going to start World War III for you." And this was significant because you had the two top NATO generals, an American and a British commander, disagreeing on policy. The American general thought he had authority by the NATO Council, by the NATO allies to take this action. The British did not. It was a never-ending discussion about who was right and who was wrong, but it shows how much the national allegiance of these top generals continued to matter even during an operation by the integrated military structure. Very significant episode. The third reason why NATO continued to be relevant after the end of the Cold War is 9/11. So this is the first time that a NATO ally had been attacked on its territory and therefore invoked Article 5. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty is this one important pillar of the alliance that says an attack against one is considered an attack against all. And for decades, people thought, well, it's going to be Germany, under Soviet attack to invoke Article 5 to get American help, or it's going to be Norway in the north or Turkey in the south. In fact, in history, history can play some funny tricks sometimes, and it was the United States that was attacked for the first time, and it invoked Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which means that the NATO allies were now bound to defend the United States against the threat, against the enemy that had perpetrated the attack of 9/11. And this, of course, resulted in the operation in Afghanistan. The first operation, called ISAF, was under United Nations mandate. And you can see the NATO forces invaded Afghanistan. They took over control of the country from the Taliban fairly quickly. They divided the country in different regions here, and that were under the command of different NATO forces. The first operation was followed by this resolute support mission. By this time, the Russians and others were fed up with NATO's presence in Afghanistan, so they pulled out. Therefore, there was no United Nations mandate for this second operation that lasted from 2014 until 2021. Again, Afghanistan was carved into different zones with American, German, Italian, and Turkish areas of responsibility. And it continued until then the decisions by then President Trump and then implemented by President Biden to pull out. It was a very difficult deployment in Afghanistan. Here you can see some troops in very complicated terrain. Some people welcome NATO. They welcome the fact that the Taliban were gone, that women could go to school, that the personal freedoms were greatly improved, but many did not. And many of the traditional Afghans, like these in these photographs, were happy when NATO left. This made, of course, for a dangerous operation in Afghanistan. Many NATO troops died, were injured until the summer of 1991, when the last of the NATO forces withdrew from Afghanistan, and the Taliban, of course, are back in power. We all know about the situation in Iraq over the course of the decades since the fall of Saddam Hussein. I want to underline that the operations in Iraq are not a NATO mission, except for a small training mission that's called the NATO mission in Iraq, where for the first time a lady general was in charge, but no combat missions were undertaken by NATO in Iraq. They were in Libya. In Libya, NATO did fight to topple the regime of Muammar Gaddafi under a dubious United Nations resolution that said NATO could protect civilians. But in fact, that didn't happen very much. A lot of civilians died anyway, and Libya is a big mess. So the operation of NATO in Libya is very controversial, and to this day, people discuss whether the no-fly zones, the arms embargo, and all the strikes that caused a lot of damage and loss of life were actually worth doing. So NATO, at the end of the second decade of the century, celebrated its 70th anniversary, and some people were quite dismayed by what leaders of NATO could say. Macron had this to say: what we're currently experiencing is the brain death of NATO. NATO was founded to face down the Warsaw Pact, and there is no Warsaw Pact. That's the quote from Macron. Well, of course, he forgot that the Warsaw Pact was created after NATO. NATO was created in 1949, and only in 1955 the Warsaw Pact was created. So NATO was created well before the Warsaw Pact even existed. This former President Trump, and maybe future President Trump, said the United Nations, the United States is the country that needs NATO the least. Again, he forgets that the United States was the first and only country to call on NATO to come to its help after 9/11 to go into Afghanistan and defeat what was considered to be the source of the threat that had produced 9/11, these Al-Qaeda forces and their Taliban allies. The reason why Trump, of course, said this is an very old quarrel among the NATO allies about spending. Since NATO was created, countries have been debating about spending, and some countries, notably the US, spend more. Greece and Turkey also spend a lot, but that's mostly to face each other. But others have consistently spent very little, and they have been accused of free riding because they say you don't spend because you know that the United States is going to cover your back and that the United Kingdom with its nuclear forces will help you. But in fact, the tacit agreement, that's my personal view, is that the United States spent more because, for one thing, it's a global power. It's the only really global power in NATO. So it's got, fleets in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean and everywhere, bases in Japan. I think the last time I counted, I saw a research, the United States has got something like 500 bases around the world. Nobody else does. So obviously the United States is going to spend more. But more importantly, the United States runs the show in NATO. And the tacit agreement has been, at least that's how I read it, you run the show and you pay for it. And the European countries were quite happy, and Canada, to live with that, to have the United States run NATO and pay for it. So you can say there's a lot of friction because of this. Of course, I would also argue that the reason why the Europeans are so inefficient is that they spend into 27 small armies instead of one large European army, which would make that spending produce much more efficient results. But that's another story. That's for another talk. So people complain, but nobody ever left NATO. That's remarkable if you think about it. We have an alliance that is 75 years old now, and not a single member has left NATO all this time. On the other hand, more and more countries, as we have seen, have asked to join, and even more countries want to join. And this was the subject of a famous talk that Vladimir Putin gave in 2007 at the famous Munich Defense Conference. He said, you have enlarged NATO already, and we don't like that, but we accepted it, no more. don't expand anymore because this will be unacceptable to us. It will be an existential threat, and it will violate what we consider the Western world, as I mentioned earlier, from people like Secretary General Werner, Secretary of State Baker, that after German unification with Germany in NATO, there would be no more expansion or enlargement of NATO. The message of Putin was very clear, and the response of the West was also quite clear. The message from Putin was dismissed. And in fact, in 2008, so 1 year later, the NATO alliance explicitly invited, although it didn't put a date on the invitation, invited Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. This would be the first two ex-Soviet republics to join NATO if you exclude the Baltic states, which I think correctly consider themselves as having been occupied by the Soviet Union, not having been part of the Soviet Union. Very different. But Ukraine and Georgia would be the first constituents of the Soviet Union to be members of NATO. And of course, that would bring NATO forces very uncomfortably close to the Russian borders. And here there's two schools of thought that have developed to explain what is going on. One is that this is not a provocation for Russia. These are free countries now. If they want to join NATO, they should be allowed to do so. And certainly no one, certainly not Russia, should be allowed to have a veto over that decision. It's for them to decide. And of course, it is for NATO to decide whether or not we want to have them in NATO. On the other hand, the argument goes, yes, they are free countries, but it would be a provocation because these countries are very close to Russia. And we all remember what happened when the Soviet Union put forces uncomfortably close to the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The United States didn't say, well, Cuba is a sovereign country. If they want to have an alliance with the Soviet Union and host Soviet forces, they're free to do so. The United States went to great lengths to prevent that from happening and to eventually reach a deal with Russia, Soviet Union then, so that the Soviet missiles would be pulled out of Cuba and the Americans pulled out their missiles from Turkey. So it is really hard to say that this would be something that does not provoke Russia. And of course, Russia has itself said many, many times that this would constitute an existential threat for them. So after this declaration in 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO, Russia takes action. And although the initial action here was by the Georgians who wanted to, understandably, liberate two parts of Georgia that had been long occupied by the Russians. In 2008, Russia went to war against Georgia. These are Russian tanks in Georgia. And of course, in 2014, Russia invaded Crimea. This again would be the subject of a different presentation, but the reason why Russia invades Crimea in 2014 and not before or after is because in 2014 and late 2013, so in the months building up to the Soviet-Russian invasion of Crimea, Ukraine was again moving very much to the west. It was about to sign a deal with the European Union. It was increasing its cooperation with NATO, although it was not a member, but it was increasing its cooperation with the military alliance. And at some point, the Maidan revolution started, and the pro-Russian government of Ukraine that even though it was pro-Russian, it was flirting with Ukraine, with the European Union, and with the West and NATO, was toppled in a coup d'etat, really, that many think was orchestrated by the West. Therefore, Russia saw the threat of a Ukrainian bulwark developing at its border, and it invaded Crimea. Crimea, as most of you perhaps know, was for centuries part of Russia. It was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev during the Soviet times, but it is completely inhabited by Russian speakers, by Russians. It's base of the Russian fleet. All of that doesn't justify the Russian invasion, to be clear. I'm not for a moment suggesting the Russian invasion of Crimea was justified or was the right thing to do. I'm just explaining why it happened and why it happened at this particular time. This is when Russia was now realizing that Ukraine was going to become a bulwark of the West at its borders. These are Russian forces going into Ukraine. Again, nobody moved. Sanctions against Russia, but nobody moved to defend Crimea. And this brings us to 2022, where Russia invades Ukraine itself. Again, NATO is not involved, although it supplies Ukraine with intelligence, training, weapons of all kinds, but NATO is not involved as such. Again, Russian tanks rolling to the west in Ukraine. And this brings us to 2024, to now, with Russia having occupied 4 oblasts, 4 regions of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian Republic, in addition to Crimea. And NATO is not intervening, although French President Macron in March, early March of this year, 2024, suggested for the first time that NATO forces could put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Pretty much everybody else in NATO immediately denied that this is even considered as a possibility, but nonetheless, the French president said that. So where does that leave Ukraine? This picture, I think, is explanatory of the situation. You have the Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, trying to reassure Ukraine, we support you, we help you, we are going to be behind you, and so on and so forth. But please be patient, you cannot be a member of NATO yet. And you have the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, saying, oh my God, I've heard this before so many times. What else do I need to go through before you actually allow me to join the alliance? And with this, I would like to end this presentation. We will see how that plays out. Of course, the Ukrainian conflict is of paramount importance for the future of NATO, and we will see at the end of this conflict, which hopefully will come very soon, what will be the state of the alliance and what will be the future of the alliance now 75 years after it was born. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye.